It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. A tale of failure, dishonesty and greed. The damning final report into the Grenfell Tower fire is published. Survivors and the families of the 72 who lost their lives 7 years ago condemn a web of blame as the fight for justice continues.
Justice to me looks like some people in jail. I don't want corporate manslaughter. That's just a huge fine to a company. That does nothing.
Also tonight, Sky News hears the harrowing account of a survivor of yesterday's Channel disaster as the small boats continue to set sail. A 14-year-old boy has been charged with the murder of 80-year-old Bim Coley, the grandfather, attacked in a park in Leicestershire. And in sport, Britain's Jack Draper wins in straight sets to reach the semi-finals of the US Open in New York. Plus, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Hello there, good evening. The sight of the Grenfell Tower on fire 7 years ago shocked the entire country. The loss of 72 lives triggered soul-searching among the political class and beyond about how such a tragedy could have happened. It also triggered an official inquiry to find the answer to that question, and today it issued its final report. Well, the report highlights systemic dishonesty by those who made and sold cladding panels and insulation, with firms manipulating tests. The government is accused of being complacent, defensive and dismissive on fire safety, with seriously defective regulation on high-rise construction and refurbishment. The report says the Conservative government was well aware of the risks posed by combustible cladding and insulation, but failed to act on what it knew. The inquiry chair called out a deliberate and sustained manipulation of fire safety testing, with conflicts of interest between inspectors and those they were inspecting. Residents saw the Tenant Management Organisation, responsible for Grenfell Tower at the time, as a bullying overlord, failing to observe its basic responsibilities. There are 58 recommendations, including a new single regulator for the construction industry and a fire safety department in government. Our first report tonight comes from our science and technology editor, Tom Clark.
It was immediately clear to anyone watching in horror as Grenfell Tower burned why the tragedy happened. The cladding surrounding it was so flammable, it reduced the tower to a blackened shell. But what wasn't clear was just how such an obvious danger could have been missed. That question fell to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and the failures it examined were so comprehensive, it's taken 7 years to provide answers to the families of the 72 people who died.
Those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. Not all of them bear the same degree of responsibility for the eventual disaster, but as our reports show, all contributed to it in one way or another, in most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed.
Present, as they have been throughout the inquiry, were representatives of survivors and those who never made it out.
The recommendations published today are basic safety principles that should already exist, highlighting how the government's role, duties and obligations have been hollowed out by privatisation. Where voids were created as the government outsourced their duties, Kingspan, Celotex and Arconic filled the gaps with substandard and combustible materials.
It was those three companies whose products literally fueled the fire. But the blame doesn't stop with them.
The victims' families may find little comfort in the fact that this definitive report into the tragedy doesn't attempt to summarise who was most to blame. But that's because it describes a catalogue of negligence so complete that it's almost unimaginable.
I call the Prime Minister.
This government recognised that failure.
I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. Today is a long-awaited day of truth, but it must now lead to a day of justice. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell.
But will it? One of the report's primary recommendations is for a new building regulator, and building guidance has already been changed. But experts warn the regulations themselves remain weak.
You can only regulate and you can only enforce the regulations the way the regulations are written. And my question is, do we have sufficient robust mechanisms to make sure that the public is represented when we come up with regulations and the way they're developed and maintained? Just changing documents and wording is just, it can be a very quick fix, but it's not a very robust way to go about it.
Better rules should be harder to exploit. Before Grenfell, that wasn't the case. Cladding manufacturers were, in the report's words, systematically dishonest, made false claims and deliberately concealed the flammability of their products. But complicit, finds the report, were the organisations charged with safety tests like these and certifying the products as safe. Chiefly the former Buildings Research Establishment, BRE, which the inquiry found following privatisation was so reliant on the industry for its revenue, it sacrificed its application of principle to its commercial interest. The BRE says it is still reviewing the report. So too are politicians, their official advisors, the contractors who refurbished the tower, fire inspectors and others singled out for their failures in the 1,700-page report. The cladding manufacturers acknowledged their role in the fire, but say they did not deceive the market and maintain their products met safety requirements. That claim may well be challenged again. With the inquiry complete, the police investigation can resume.
We have one chance to get our investigation right. We will present the best possible case to the Crown Prosecution Service. I recognise it is such an incredibly long time for our investigation, but I think it will still take us another 12 to 18 months before we will present that charging file to the Crown Prosecution Service.
This warehouse contains the police evidence, 320,000 artefacts from the fire and the materials that caused it, an exhibition of the failures described in the report. It urges its 58 recommendations be adopted to prevent another tragedy like Grenfell, but for the families of the 72 killed, it's prosecutions that should come next.
And Tom joins us from the Grenfell Tower in West London. So what does this mean then, Tom, for the families and for the survivors?
I think listening to them, they're satisfied that this report is a detailed and forensic account of a corrupt construction industry and fire safety system that doomed the building behind me that they used to call home, and in which 72 people died, let's not forget, 18 of them children. But I think what's also significant, listening to them again, is that it doesn't tell them anything really that they didn't already know. Yes, we had Sir Martin Moore-Bick describe in detail about the failures that conspired to cause this, about the corruption and sometimes the deceit, but in general incompetence of many of the people responsible for keeping them safe. But really, in terms of why this tragedy happened, that was clear to them quite early on. It doesn't really move things forward very much. You listen to them, it's almost like this was something, the inquiry, that had to be got out of the way, that was necessary. They accept that, but it had to be done. But now is the time to move on and the work has to happen. And obviously the work they want to see is the recommendations of the report implemented, but also be satisfied that that's going to happen with some urgency. They have been waiting a very long time for this. But also, too, now the report's out of the way, of course, the prospect of prosecutions, because I think they feel, and I think many people would accept, that unless the individuals and the organisations responsible for this tragedy don't face justice, it would be a travesty if those that profited from it aren't in some way forced to repay the debt that they owe. That would be very wrong indeed. So I think they're going to look for that. But I think the report serves another thing, maybe the rest of us, maybe not so much for the families, but to remind us, because it's been so long, of how many people died and the fact that the suffering of
the survivors and the families of those that lost will continue forever, and that it's time has passed, really, for everyone to get on and do something about it and make sure the system, the industry, changes for good, and also hope that prosecutions for the fire follow.
Tom Clark, thank you. Well, as Tom mentioned, at the heart of today's report were the 72 victims who died, the survivors who escaped, and a community traumatised by the tragedy. Sky's Rachel Venables has been speaking to some of them.
Ernie Vital, Debbie Lamprell, Gary Maunders, Bertie Haftom.
The names and faces of the 72, killed when a fire ripped through their home, a disaster which we now know could and should have been prevented.
The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years.
7 years on, families are still racked with grief.
Moses was just a very gentle soul. He protected both Jackie and I throughout our teenage years. He was just a lovely person. He helped me raise my children.
Today's Grenfell Inquiry report finally brings some answers.
I was very happy that the inquiry team named the major players. The fact that he mentioned the construction industry, it means that they really understood that it was important that these people be held accountable.
Ed Defan escaped from the tower that night, just months after predicting a tragedy in the building.
For me, I think the thing about it is that there isn't a Poirot moment where there's like one culprit. It's kind of like grappling with all these different elements and how badly we were failed by so many people, with the consequence that we lost 72 lives, our homes were destroyed, and a community has been put into trauma for 7 years.
For the survivors and those who lost family, friends and neighbours that night, this is a momentous moment. The inquiry report going through in forensic, painstaking detail how over decades a series of failures and deliberate decisions led to this tragedy. But for the community, what comes next is even more important.
From a personal perspective, justice to me looks like some people in jail. I don't want corporate manslaughter. That's just a huge fine to a company. That does nothing. Things need to change. Grenfell can't happen again.
The Tenant Management Organisation.
The tragedy traumatised an entire community, and at 11 o'clock, people came together as the report was published.
The report is and should be taken as now a statement of truth. I think residents in the local community, as well as bereaved family and survivors who we are thinking of today, who have gone through so much, have waited long enough.
For years, survivors and the bereaved have demanded three things: truth, change and justice. They now have the truth of what happened that night. Next, they want accountability and action. Rachel Venables, Sky News in North Kensington.
Well, the families of Grenfell victims have spoken of a web of blame underlying the scandal. Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire has this analysis of those that the report has put at the centre of that web.
The first original report from the Grenfell Inquiry looked at the night of the fire itself, examining things like the fire brigade's actions, but it also found that combustible cladding was the principal reason the blaze spread so quickly. This second and final report, nearly 1,700 pages of it, is about how that came to be the case, and it paints a damning picture of failings at almost every possible point. We'll start with the companies that manufactured the cladding. The report found that they engaged in systematic dishonesty on behalf of those companies. There were three companies that supplied the cladding materials: Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan. We'll start with Arconic. It is an American firm. When it comes to the construction of this, they had a role in the cladding in terms of the outside. So this is where all the cladding was, all the way up Grenfell Tower. When it comes to how the panels were constructed, the cladding Arconic made the panels on the outside, these thin aluminium sheets on the front of the cladding here. And the inquiry looked at their role and it found that the company had deliberately concealed from the market the true extent of the danger. Moving on to the next company, Celotex. Now, they were also involved in the cladding as well in a slightly different way. They were looking after the insulation. We can see that rather than the front panels, which we were just talking about, Celotex were making this insulation that lay behind them. Again, according to the inquiry, Celotex embarked on a dishonest scheme to mislead its customers and the wider market. And finally, Kingspan. They also made some of the insulation in this tower, in that cladding. And the report found that from 2005 until after this inquiry had begun, Kingspan knowingly created a false market in insulation for use on buildings over 18 metres in height. Well, how did those companies manage to put out dangerous products on the market? The report says it was with the complicity of the Buildings Research Establishment, the BRE. It's supposed to be an independent tester, but it also got paid by those cladding companies to do the testing. And as a result, the inquiry found it had sacrificed a rigorous application of principle to its commercial interests. So if BRE and the cladding companies are doing all this, what is government doing at the same time? It's not holding them to account. This is what the inquiry found about the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and its Tenant Management Office. It found persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people. And that indifference went all the way up to the top of government. In particular, the report singled out the years from 2010 onwards, with what they called the government's deregulatory agenda, enthusiastically supported by some junior ministers and the Secretary of State, meaning that matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. Failures on every rung of the ladder, on almost every page of this report. And that's why survivors and families of victims have said it wasn't a system that was broken, but one that was built that way.
Well, Tom mentioned at the end there the questions for politicians. Sky's political editor Beth Rigby is in Westminster for us. And Beth, another big occasion when the failures of big institutions, including the political establishment, is in the spotlight.
That's right, Anna. The Prime Minister today talked about this being a day of truth, but also that victims deserved in the future a day of justice. And when we talk about a day of truth, it certainly chimed with recent scandals that have been discussed in the Commons, be it the post office scandal, the infected blood scandal, the Grenfell tragedy. At the heart of it, you see successive governments failing in their basic duty to protect and serve their citizens, and that certainly was the theme of today. The report revealed that this tragedy could have been avoided, that in 1991 there had been a serious fire in Merseyside where the risks of cladding had been flagged to politicians. 26 years later, 72 people dying at Grenfell Tower because those warnings were not heard or acted upon. And Keir Starmer today fulsome in the apology. He said it had been decades of failures. He said he wanted to apologise on behalf of the British state. It should never have happened. He said, "I am deeply sorry." He told the victims, "You have been let down so badly before, during and after this tragedy." And he also spoke of a private visit to Grenfell and said that it was his very personal mission now as Prime Minister that the legacy of Grenfell was going to be put right in his premiership. One of his team telling me tonight that Keir Starmer was genuinely very impacted by that visit he recently made. But if that is the truth or speaking the truth, what about justice? The government today said that all companies involved in this report would be stopped from bidding for public contracts. That's something they can do quickly. He also pledged to speed up renewing cladding and also threatening companies if they don't do it, so trying to do that. And finally, he said of the 58 recommendations in that report, the government would consider all of them carefully and would report back to the Commons within 6 months. But as we know that the criminal proceedings could take 18 months, perhaps more. So for the victims, the moment of truth but after 7 years of waiting, the day of justice, I would say, still some way off.
Beth reporting there on the Grenfell Inquiry and what happens next. Thank you. Now, Sky News has heard the harrowing account of a survivor of a small boat which sank in the English Channel yesterday, leading to the deaths of 12 people, mostly women. Despite the ongoing risk and threat of death, our team in northern France also heard from people still determined to make the journey to the UK. Here's our international correspondent, John Sparks.
24 hours after the death of a dozen people off the coast of northern France, migrants in rubber boats were back in the water, trying to cross the Channel to Britain. At a bus stop near Boulogne, we found migrants who'd just failed to make the crossing, French police slashing their boat on the beach. Among the would-be passengers, 5-year-old twins with blistered feet. They'd been up all night walking, and plenty of disappointed young men.
Yes, my country has too much problem. I must go to London.
The dream had been delayed. The only trip they'd make was in the local bus. Yet business is booming. These pictures filmed on Tuesday by a smuggler advertising his services. The same day, a different vessel carrying more than 60 people capsized. Officials said the casualties were largely from Eritrea. Still, some Eritreans survived this disaster, and we found one called Daoud, a 25-year-old, here on the right.
The boat ripped off, ripped off, and everybody was sinking. People who can swim, they could swim and survived. The painful thing is that, women, babies could not save themselves. Painful.
Did you see what happened?
I mean, I don't know myself at that time. I was totally lost, because of panic. Yes.
Daoud was living in an encampment in Calais, which the police have now destroyed. But that's not enough for the city's right-wing MP. France must do more, he says, by removing migrants from the coast.
The solution is on the French side of the border, on the French side of the channel. We have to prevent them from staying in the camps near to the sea.
So now 1 minute of silence.
Members of the community in Calais have held a vigil to mark and mourn the loss of those who died in the latest small boat disaster. But the risks and financial rewards remain fundamentally unchanged. John Sparks, Sky News, in northern France.
A 14-year-old boy has been charged with murder following the death of an 80-year-old in Lestershire. Bim Coley was attacked while walking his dog in a park on Sunday. His family today paid tribute to him as a loving husband, dad and granddad. The 14-year-old, who can't be named for legal reasons, is due to appear in court tomorrow.
Hello and good evening. Live from Jerusalem, I'm Yalda Hakim. This evening, the Israeli Prime Minister doubled down on his determination to see his campaign in Gaza to some form of victory, despite the growing pressure on him both at home and abroad. Benjamin Netanyahu addressed foreign media at a news conference this evening. He referred to various maps of the Gaza Strip, insisting that Israel must maintain control of the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza. He said only relentless military pressure could defeat Hamas and secure a deal to return hostages. Have a listen.
The first deal that we got was a result of our invasion, the military pressure we put in. They gave us the hostages. After that, they thought, well, we'll have the international pressure turn on Israel, so we won't have to make any concessions. But after Rafah, their tune changed. And they began to change. If we leave Rafah, if we leave the Philadelphia corridor, there won't be any pressure. We won't get the hostages. I said I'm willing to make a deal. The real obstacle to making a deal is not Israel, and it's not me. It's Hamas.
That was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is doubling down on Hamas. But that isn't the mood here in Israel. Many people have been out on the streets pointing the finger of blame on Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. And to better understand the strategy of this government, I spoke to the Minister of Strategic Affairs and the man who is considered the brains of Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi as he is known, Ron Dermer. Have a listen.
This is a nation in turmoil. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets of Israel for days, demanding their government do more to release the hostages. The question is anyone listening?
There are people in Israel who are angry at their government, but I think the vast majority of people of Israel are angry at Hamas. And I think the international community should direct its anger at Hamas.
Ron Dermer, Benjamin Netanyahu's chief advisor and often described as Bibi's brain, rejects accusations that his prime minister isn't doing enough. Negotiations have been going on for months. The current sticking point, a 9-mile sliver of land between Gaza and Egypt. Known as the Philadelphia Corridor, long considered a lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza. Israel says it's the entry point for rearming Hamas.
People who have been military generals in this country for over 30 years, people who have run this country, who have been in charge of that corridor, say that for the Israeli people, for the state of Israel, that is inconsequential. What is important is to ensure that those hostages are brought back alive and that they're rescued from Gaza. And the only way to do that is to reach a ceasefire agreement like the one that you reached in November, which allowed you to bring 105 hostages home and allow for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, which brought respite to the Palestinian people as well.
There's a big focus right now on the Philadelphia corridor. I can tell you we worked with the Americans and the other mediators to make clear what our position was during any phase one part of the deal. When you start negotiations over a permanent ceasefire and what that looks like long term, it's a different question.
As international pressure mounts on Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire deal with Hamas, the UK government this week suspended the sale of some arms to Israel.
I think it's a mistake, not only because of the timing, that it comes 2 days or 3 days after the execution of hostages. I think it's a mistake because Israel's not violating international humanitarian law.
Israel is increasingly isolated at a time of intense internal crisis, while facing war on multiple fronts. It seems Benjamin Netanyahu is in no mood to compromise.
Speaking there to Ron Dermer, who says that he is speaking on behalf of the Israeli people, but that doesn't seem to be the sentiment and the feeling here across this country. Just 4 weeks until a year where they mark October 7. And of course, the devastation that the Palestinian people continue to feel. 40,000 Palestinians reportedly killed in this conflict, 100,000 injured and dead in total. This conflict continues. We'll have to wait and see how it evolves over the next coming weeks and months. But for now, back to you in London, Anna.
Yalda, thank you. Now, the former Home Secretary, Dame Priti Patel, has become the first candidate to be eliminated from the Conservative Party leadership contest. Dame Priti received the backing of 14 of her colleagues in the first round of voting. Leading the pack was Robert Jenrick with 28 votes, followed by Kemi Badenoch with 22 and James Cleverly third with 21 votes. Trailing behind them, Tom Tugendhat with 17 votes and Mel Stride on 16. For the full story, here's our political correspondent, Darren McCaffrey.
2 months since the Conservatives slumped to the worst defeat in 200 years, the contest to find a new leader has finally begun.
As a result of the ballot, Priti Patel is eliminated from the contest.
Of the 6, Priti Patel is out. A former Home Secretary, once the darling of the Tory right, she will be disappointed that her first, and probably her last attempt to become Tory leader, has ended in failure. For those still in the race, their bid to attract new supporters is already underway.
How important is it to top the poll, if you like, first time round?
Well, I'm very encouraged. Rob Jenrick was, he was way behind in the bookies list anyway. It's always difficult to tell what colleagues are going to do. but he was the outsider in this race at the beginning of the contest, early summer. He's now come out top. That's very encouraging.
We've seen a really strong performance from Kemi. She did not start this race as the front runner. She's now solidified her position as the second-ranked candidate, and I'm very optimistic about where we go from here.
You must be pretty pleased. I mean, you know, James not just finished third, but a pretty competitive third at that.
It was a good result for James. We're not complacent. The mission was to get into the next round, and we've done that. And now we need to persuade more colleagues to support him.
You stick with your party through the good and the bad.
Away from Westminster, it will ultimately be up to members to decide. And in the marginal seat of Kettering, activists seem as divided as MPs.
I'm still yet to make my mind up. I think there's obviously positives and negatives to all the candidates.
I feel like they need to pick a leader who can unite the party rather than just... It was at one time it looked like we were two parties within one.
To be honest with you, I've only heard of 2 names out of the 6.
Everybody in the country knew Boris, but there isn't anybody whose name is like that, is there anymore?
The next elimination vote will be held on Tuesday, which whittled down the remaining hopefuls to 4. Those 4 will then appear at Tory party conference to set out their case before 2 more rounds of voting leaves just 2 candidates, with members then picking the new leader, with the results announced on November 2nd. With only 12 votes between the remaining 5 candidates, this contest is unusually tight, a reflection of the deep divisions within a devastated Tory party about which direction to now take. Darren McCaffrey, Sky News.
The United States has witnessed another tragic chapter of its battle against gun violence after 4 people were killed and 9 injured in a school shooting in the state of Georgia. The suspect, who is now in custody, is a 14-year-old student at the high school. Our US correspondent James Matthews has more.
You can hear sobbing as pupils hold their hands in the air and hide under tables as police check classrooms. They've been hiding from a shooter in the school. It's another scene by now frighteningly familiar. Armed officers rushed towards the site of the multiple shooting. Medical teams treated casualties, and there were the pupils who'd fled from an active shooter in their high school.
Just hear the gunshots. And everybody get down, everybody get down.
He started firing and we all ran into the corner. We ran to the bathroom, some in the closet, and locked ourselves for like 15, 20 minutes.
I saw like a huge puddle of blood in our classroom, and it like dropped my stomach.
Helicopters were used to transfer the injured to hospital. Pupils gathered on the athletic ground at Appalachia High as family members filed in to be reunited with sons and daughters. Police identified the perpetrator as a 14-year-old pupil at the school who'd surrendered and was taken into custody. At an emotional news conference, the local sheriff spoke of evil.
I never imagined that I would be speaking to the media in my career over something that happened today, the pure evil that happened today.
On the campaign trail in New Hampshire, the shooting was addressed by the vice president.
It's senseless. It is, we've got to stop it. And we have to end this epidemic of gun violence in our country once and for all. You know, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way.
Donald Trump posted on social media, "Our hearts are with the victims and loved ones of those affected by the tragic event in Winder, Georgia. These cherished children were taken from us far too soon by a sick and deranged monster." Of the 4 killed, 2 were pupils and 2 were members of staff. They are the latest grim statistics that speak to a country's struggle with gun violence. James Matthews, Sky News in Washington.
Now, it's been a night to remember for Britain's Jack Draper at the US Open. He's into his first tennis Grand Slam semi-final after beating the Australian Alex de Minaur in straight sets. At the top in these pictures, Draper broke his opponent 4 times in the first 2 sets to take them 6-3 and 7-5. The 22-year-old then winning the last 4 games to claim the third 6-2, and he's yet to drop a set at Flushing Meadows. Congratulations, of course, to him. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview tonight, joined by the Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, and the Whitehall Editor of the Daily Mail, Claire Ellicott. Welcome to both of you. Well, certainly among the stories we will be discussing this on the front of the Mail. They ask, will they ever get justice as the damning Grenfell report is finally published? More on that, of course, in just a moment. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, and Whitehall Editor of the Daily Mail, Claire Ellicott. Welcome and great to see both of you. So let's see what's on the front pages then, starting with the Mirror. Its front page picturing the 72 who died in the Grenfell Tower fire with the headline, "Now Get Them Justice." In the eye, everyone failed them. The Daily Mail asks, will they ever get justice? The Metro goes with the headline, Grenfell, the 26-year countdown to disaster. The Guardian quotes the report saying a disaster caused by dishonesty and greed. The Times also uses the same words but reports that families demand manslaughter charges. The Daily Express shows the tower ablaze and says 72 killed by dishonesty, indifference and complacency. Official failings and industry deceits led to the Grenfell tragedy, writes the Financial Times. In other news, The Telegraph reports that sewage leak water bosses are to face 2 years in jail. And meantime, the Daily Star, I'll tell all I know about the little green men, reporting that Donald Trump will reveal all the information the US has about alien life. A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head to Kevin and to Claire. Welcome to both of you. You know, nearly all of them, not surprisingly, leading on this long-awaited report into the 72 lives who were lost, how dangerous cladding got to be on a high-rise building, the decisions that led up to the moment, and it is excoriating.
Exactly, and I mean, we've been waiting so long for this report. It's been 7 years that this inquiry has taken, and rightly so, the families are furious that they haven't had justice yet. And the real problem is they may not get justice for some time yet. There's not expected to be any criminal trials beginning before a decade on from this, you know, debacle that happened in 2017. So many of these people who lost their families, who went through the worst imaginable times, they're now still waiting for justice. And there are failings by so many of the companies that were involved, by government, by the fire service. This report lays them all bare, but so many of these people who have been caught up in all of this don't actually feel like they've got any sort of, you know, righting of the wrong, because there's no charges, no one's paid for any of this. There's lots of talk of reform and changing the system and bringing in more regulation. None of this has happened. We're 7 years on, and what they asked for when this happened was that there would never be a repeat of this, and there's no guarantee still that this wouldn't happen again today.
Yes, specifically naming and making accusations against the cladding company, for example, 2 insulation companies, the agency that ran the tower, the council, central government. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it? But in terms of the 72 who died, you know, was there comfort when we heard the chair of the inquiry say, we can say with some certainty that they died from toxic smoke inhalation before the fire got to them? I mean, this is so distressing for so many people.
Yeah, possibly. I think, you know, 3 fell off, jumped out of the building as well. And you just see the faces, and it brings it, because it is about people and how they were treated. And Keir Starmer made the point, because many were working class people of colour, they get ignored by the system. You see this time after time. I thought that was probably the bit of the statement that I don't think a Conservative Prime Minister would have said. Like a Conservative Prime Minister could have delivered the rest. And you look at the faces. There are 7 we still don't have photographs for, but it's just kind of horrific. And the Guardian, you know, Grenfell, a disaster caused by dishonesty and greed. That's absolutely true. But the piece on the front starts on police are under pressure to accelerate the criminal investigation. And they haven't been, which I think is absolutely the case, because if you're going to be able to move on, if you can move on at all after this, I suspect it would be after those prosecutions, when you would hope that the guilty end up behind bars. The police haven't been entirely idle. They've taken 50 statements, but they can't just take this report now and say we're going to prosecute all these people. You've got to build a case against them that is based on other evidence. So if you're waiting 10 years for the trials, which is possible, might be 9, might be 10, that is a long, long time. We're used to the wheels of justice going slowly, but this seems ridiculous. And I know it's not straight comparison with the people in the riots, but you got very swift justice there, in part because I think there's just a lot of video evidence. The idiots were filming each other and boasting about it and then putting it on social media. So you could put that before a court, and they were pleading guilty. This is more complex, I know, but it does just feel it's rather too slow. But you see that 1,700-page report, incredibly thorough. You've got to say, what have they been doing? You can see it is thorough. And again, just like the Hillsborough report or infected blood. You see, there was just a disregard for people. I suspect we'll get exactly the same out of the post office report when it finally comes. People or institutions or systems just go their own way, and they forget at the end of the day this is all about people.
Yes, and the Daily Mail picking up on the will they ever get justice question as well. Grenfell agony for the families. The Financial Times, official failings and industry deceits led to the Grenfell tragedy. It's not just that, is it? It's the fire service as well, how they operated. The first moment the fire detected, 12:54, but it wasn't until 2:47 a.m. in the morning that the stay put order was revoked. Hours of waiting. The last rescue at 8:07 in the morning. They still tried to get people out. I was there the next day, and people there, the atmosphere was really extraordinary. You know, this febrile sense of anger that everybody felt, but also people talked about hearing screaming all night coming from that tower. So this whole point of a stay-put order, when it was quite clear that there was a building failure with the cladding on fire vertically up the side of the building.
Well, it turned into a funeral pyre, but that is not criticism of the firefighters and their bravery. It is the institution, the London Fire Brigade, the service itself, and those mistakes. And they
sticking to the norms, which was that it should have been compartmentalised.
Exactly.
It was a concrete structure without.
So I think you've got to, that has to be borne in mind, because the way the inquiry was constructed, you looked at the night first. And so it felt like firefighters were being thrown to the wolves and unfairly criticised at the beginning. Now you get it in context when you realise the lying, the cheating, the corruption, the skullduggery that turned that building into an inferno.
Yeah.
Well, the Metro talks about the 26-year countdown to disaster. They talk about a blaze in 1991, you know, another one in London, which led to 6 deaths as well, in which recommendations also weren't followed. One after another, opportunities were missed to change it. And that's why this has to be different. That's the point, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, so many of these problems with cladding were flagged so long ago, and actually they're still not resolved. Loads of buildings in London still have this cladding. And you made reference to the fire. There was a fire in Dagenham recently that had some of this cladding on it. And that was one of the reasons Grenfell was so awful, because no one could almost understand how this fire couldn't be put out. And you had all of this fire brigade everywhere, I remember, and no one seemed to understand why this building was still on fire. And so much of it was, you know, the report talks about the cladding companies that were involved and whether this cladding was just so flammable that it just ignited the whole building. And the idea that, you know, there are still buildings with this stuff on is just unbelievable.
Yeah. There is a politics here now. It encompasses part of the Labour period, but the big deregulation drive, when I used to hear let's have a bonfire of red tape, was in the Cameron period. Eric Pickles gets criticised as the housing minister, just disregarding safety. He denies that, but nevertheless, the report comes out harshly against him.
Your front page, the Daily Mirror, just to end on there, you know, a simple message: now get them justice. For the 72, for the survivors, for the community, and indeed for those still living, as you said, in dangerously clad buildings. Well, plenty more still to come, including in the Telegraph, which says that Robert Jenrick is now the front runner in the Tory leadership race after coming top in the first round of voting. Discussing that in just a moment.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours, and we're going to take it back.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power.
Now, freedom!
There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes, torrential rain and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued with its ultimatum to the people of Ashkelon, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in.
Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous.
We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before?
Yes.
Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news. Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview, joined once again, as you can see, by Kevin Maguire and Claire Ellicott. Welcome back to both of you. So, Tory leadership, then there was one less. Dame Priti Patel, first to be, I nearly said evicted. It's not quite the right word, you know what I mean? Anyway, does that mean, as the Telegraph says, Claire, that Robert Jenrick is indeed the front runner or not?
Well, he has the most support from Tory MPs at this stage, which is good. I mean, Kemi is the bookmaker's favourite, but what it means when we go into the Tory conference is different, because so there's one more person to be eliminated from the race. Mel Stride has the fewest votes, so possibly might be him, who knows. And then 4 Tory candidates go into the conference season where they're then decided, it's then whittled down to 2 of them. So at the moment, we're still very much in the stages of deciding who is.
I'm loving it.
Front
You're
runner.
laughing.
Well, no,
We've done a lot of these.
Because it feels like an irrelevant sideshow at the moment, but it is important because they will be the leader of the leader of the opposition.
To hold the government to account.
Yeah,
that is the point of
politics is volatile, and you never quite know what happens. Although I would put a fair bit of money on whoever wins this will not be Prime Minister. But you look at it, you've got to think Jenrick had a good day.
Let's look at the numbers while you're talking.
All right, I think Claire may disagree. I think Jenrick had a good day because he topped it. Cleverly had a good day because he did better than he was expected. Mel Stride did better because he didn't go out and he was thought to be last. But Kemi Badenoch, well, as the favourite, she's a bit behind there. And Tom Tugendhat, he didn't do as well, did he? Tommy Tugboat. No. And Patel, that's not... that's not pretty for Patel.
So the point is, where do her votes go next? And also, how political is it? Do MPs literally back somebody they think is going to be the winner because they want a job in the future? I mean, is it that simple?
Well, the Tory party was called the most cynical electorate going, so there are a lot of quotes being bandied around about careerism today. So who knows where those votes go, but I would take a fair punt on them going towards Robert Jenrick because he is... There's a lot of talk about immigration in this leadership race, and the person whose hardest line on immigration and the rightist wing candidate will probably be the one who the members elect. So the Tory MPs have to make a decision at this stage: who goes through, who are those final two, and who. What do they say? And you know, Priti Patel is on the right of the party. She's former Home Secretary. She is hardline on immigration. Robert Jenrick's former immigration minister who quit the government because he was concerned about how immigration wasn't being handled very well. So they both. I feel like those votes will go to him.
When the members last time came up with Liz Truss, do you think it would be better that the person they don't pick should be made leader? I mean, would that just be more sensible for that party?
Yeah, that's actually what happened if you work out what happened after 49 days. Anyway, Daily Telegraph, Kevin, quickly, sewage leak, water bosses to face 2 years in jail. What's the story here?
Yeah, this is the Labour crackdown, and if they don't cooperate with inquiries, they could face two years in jail. I'll believe it when it happens. Of course, the government could say if it never happens, it's because they all cooperated, because they were threatened with 2 years in jail. But I'm a little surprised the Telegraph has splashed on this rather than Grenfell, but they did lead on it this morning, so maybe they just went a day ahead.
Both of you, thank you very much indeed. Kevin Maguire, Claire Ellicott, thank you. See you for the 11, obviously. Obviously, coming up also in our programme, the damning final report into the Grenfell Tower fire finds systemic dishonesty from cladding firms and decades of failure. More to come.